they're going to talk about how to best get faculty and administrators on the same page for new assessment practices. I know that that's something that can be a very difficult mountain to climb for a bunch of people trying to implement new assessment practices at their schools. Just for a little bit of background, both Dr. Souza and Dr. Matthews each have really, really, really outstanding credentials to be talking about assessment. Dr. Souza has been published in the National Institute for Learning Outcomes Assessment magazine several times, and Dr. Matthews recently won a couple of awards for assessment as well. They both have been acknowledged by AACP as being very, very outstanding leaders in the assessment field. So without further ado, I will just hand this over to them, and everybody enjoy.
Thank you very much, Carter. And this is Jane Souza. And we're very happy that you're taking some time to join us this afternoon. I have to say, one of the questions that I am asked most as I work with other campuses across the country is how do you get faculty to buy into the whole assessment process? In fact, I got a phone call on that as recently as yesterday. And it's a really interesting question because I see us as not administrators. I serve as an administrator, assistant dean of assessment. It's not so much getting the faculty to buy into assessment as to partner with them. And what we would like to talk to you about today is how I think we've worked out a successful partnership between administration and faculty to a different way to look at assessment perhaps. So with that, I'll start with everybody in. We are truly working on aligning the faculty and administrators in this new way to look at assessment. And, okay, one of the things we start with what is it that the administrators want? What are they looking for? Why are they always bothering faculty with give me data, give me assessment, get involved with assessment? And then we're going to discuss a little bit what do the faculty want? And then how do we align the two and meet both of their needs? And to sum it up, how can we work together? And that's our agenda for our discussion today. So what do the faculty administrators, the administrators want? You're hearing constantly about that we want to close the loop. You're actually hearing about that ad nauseum, I suspect. But what is the loop? I'm sure at this point we all know it's just completing that assessment cycle, starting with what are the learning outcomes we want to achieve. So we write clearly written outcome statements, and then we find ways to provide experiences to the students so they can learn these outcomes. And then we want to assess the student performance on these outcomes and then use the results of those assessments to inform teaching and learning practice. So this should look familiar. It's exactly what comes out of the Middle States Commission on Higher Education. And I suspect that you will find almost the same thing in each of the 7 accrediting bodies across the country. We're all looking for the that assessment cycle to be completed. So that's what the administrators are constantly after, because we're working all the time on serving the accreditors, but more importantly, serving our institutions and allowing for continuous improvement of our programs. So faculty are the ones that get us this information that we're all looking for. Faculty can give us the information that allows us to complete the map of a curriculum. Now, administrators want this at the local level. You're at the department level, at the institution level, your provost is looking for this information, your accreditors are looking for this institution, and frankly, the federal government is looking for this institution, for this information. We want to know, you have a curriculum, how do you cover it? How much do you cover it? How do the students perform on this curriculum that you value so much? And if they're not performing, what are you doing about it? What kind of changes are you making? And are you making those changes based on evidence? This is basic information that every person wants. Where do we get it? We get it from the faculty. If you look at this old curriculum map, the way we used to account for information, we would say, okay, we have so many learning outcomes for our program, and we have so many courses in our program, and we'll put a little X every time we hit one of the learning outcomes from our program. If we don't have any columns without an X, we're good. We have it covered. Well, if you think about all those constituents now who are looking for that information, that really isn't quite enough anymore. This tells everyone that we're covering what we say we're covering. What it doesn't say is, are the students learning it? So now we've developed more of an evidence-based curriculum map. We take that same map and we're layering it with data that shows how the students are performing in each of those areas. So if you look at this particular curriculum map, you're going to see in student learning outcome 3, we have a student performance overall of 69.5%. Now, I don't know anybody who would be happy with that outcome. So what it tells us is, okay, let's look at learning outcome 3. Let's look where we teach it, and let's how we teach it, and try to figure out why the students aren't performing as well as we would like them to perform. Again, the administrators are collecting this information. They're reporting it out through the chain of command, through the assessment professionals, the department chairs, the deans, and the provosts. They're all getting this information. But where are they getting it from? The only place they can get it from is in the classroom. So that's why we're bothering the faculty all the time. They're sitting on this gold mine. They have all of the information that we want. Again, not just to serve the accreditors, but to tell ourselves, hey, how are we doing? Is our program of value? What are our students getting out of this program? How do we know we're meeting the outcomes that we are striving to meet? So this is another example. Let me just show you a sample longitudinal data that we collect. And from an administrative perspective, I love this map because it shows, okay, we ask knowledge, application, and synthesis level questions. For us, we know there are 6 levels of Bloom's taxonomy, but we have found that we can identify questions at those levels fairly accurately. We couldn't so much at all 6 levels. So we settled on looking at 3 levels. We know that the students are, if you look at this map, the students are performing as we would expect, best on the knowledge, a little less on the application, a little less on the synthesis. But from this chart, what's most intriguing to me is the low percentage of synthesis questions that we're asking. And so if this is at an early stage in the educational process, we're okay with that. But if we're moving through the 2nd year, 3rd year, 4th year, obviously this has to change. We have to flip this and have much more in the synthesis. So from an administrative perspective, I'm looking at this very, very carefully, but I can't do anything about it. I can just report on the data, I can look at the data, I can provide evidence reports, but I can't impact any change. It's the faculty that have to impact the change. Same thing when it comes down to the content. Here we're mapping, this is information from a school of pharmacy, so we're looking at cardiovascular, respiratory, gastrointestinal, etc. And we see the lowest point of student performance is that 77%. So I have this great data, it's wonderful, wonderful report. What can I do with it? I can't do anything with it except go back to the faculty and partner with them. So I think the main thing I want to convey is that why is it the assessment people and the deans and the provosts are always asking for this data and bothering the faculty? Because they're sitting on the gold mine. They're sitting on what everybody wants, and that is the data from what's going on in their classroom. So that's why we at this St. John Fisher College have taken the approach of studying embedded assessment, looking at the data from the coursework, from the assessments that are embedded in the everyday classroom. And I think a perfect person to describe how we do that collaboration, administration, working on the data and reporting on the data in collaboration with the faculty is Dr. Jennifer Matthews, who's an outstanding faculty member who really gets it and partners with us to make evidence-based changes. And with that, Dr. Matthews, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, great. Thank you, Dr. Souza. Again, thank you for the opportunity to talk to you a little bit about the faculty perspective on what we're doing in this assessment process. So when I think about it from my day-to-day, everyday process, the first question I ask myself is, who am I accountable to? And you know, as you heard from Dr. Souza, certainly one of the places I'm accountable is to the administration. We want to make sure our curriculum is sound. We want to make sure students are performing well. We want to see those end targets, things like their licensing exams, that they're performing well. But there are other people on any given day that I'm accountable to. For me, one of the most important as a faculty member is obviously the students. Many of our courses are team taught, so I'm accountable to the other faculty that are in that course with me. It adds some unique challenges when we're in team taught courses, but this process of assessment we're going to talk about actually helps to align everyone and make sure that we're all communicating in an effective way and that the students are getting the best experience possible. From an assessment perspective, I think the important thing for faculty to recognize is that we do assessment every day. We may not take credit for it as assessment, and we may not identify it as assessment, but it certainly is. When we ask ourselves the questions about how effective am I in the classroom, was that lecture effective, was that section effective, did the students learn it, did they understand it? If they didn't, what am I doing to change it? So I'm always asking myself questions about my own effectiveness in relationship to the students. And then the other thing that, again, we don't necessarily do is take credit for the work that we do. We put a lot of hours into preparing materials and into making sure that that experience in the classroom is a positive one for the students. But honestly, before my experiences with Dr. Souza, I looked at a lot of what we were doing in assessment and said, yeah, but that's my job. It is my job, but that doesn't mean that I can't take credit for those assessments and take credit for the things that I'm doing really well in the classroom. And we'll talk a little bit about kind of what the process looked like before we implemented ExamSoft and now that we're using ExamSoft. Okay. So what happens in the classroom? You know, this is really where a lot of our assessment data is being generated. So, you know, we're thinking about me as a faculty member, what am I teaching the students? What are the students learning and how am I assessing that learning? Okay, so it all starts at that first point. How am I preparing myself? So what are the strategies I employ to encourage learning? What are the different techniques that I use? That's going to appear on some of the further maps that I'm going to show you in a few minutes. But those are some of the first questions I'm thinking about. I'm thinking about how am I going to get this material across to students? And then if I present a lecture or if I go through a series of lectures and I'm getting back from the students that they're really not understanding something, or I give an assessment and it's very clear that students are understanding, what am I doing in real time to make sure that students have that content knowledge and they're not leaving my class with a deficit? And how am I documenting those changes? And that's really the important part of it. Again, as good faculty members, we're always making changes. You're always looking at your students and saying, okay, you guys didn't get that. I'm going to take a step back. I'm going to readdress that concept. I'm going to do another technique. I'm going to try another way of explaining it. But we don't always document that and say, that's assessment. I did an assessment in the class, realized the students were performing, and now I need to document it. Importantly, these course level maps, which is what I'm going to show you, also serve as a historical record. So it's an opportunity for me to look back across multiple years at where I started from, the changes I've made, the reasons I've made those changes. But importantly, if I leave any given course, it's a document that I can pass on to somebody who's taking over my course material so that they're not reinventing the wheel every single time that someone new takes on a material I had taught in the past. Excuse me. So really, the first place when I'm thinking about the classroom, the first place that I'm creating a contract with the students and I'm really starting to reflect on what my course is going to look like is really the course syllabus. So what you see on the screen now is just a very small snapshot of what might go on to one of our syllabi. So this is an example from a syllabus in systems pharmacology. And what you can see is all of our syllabi will indicate what the course learning outcome is. But then importantly, you see two additional columns. One is, for my intents and purposes, ACP Appendix B, which is just our accreditation standard. And then the other column you see is the School of Pharmacy learning outcomes. So each one of the outcomes that are on my syllabus, you can now see how they're all linked. So from the course level, accreditation standard, School of Pharmacy level. And then when students get a lecture from me, I also give them lecture learning outcomes. And those lecture learning outcomes will map back to these same 3 things. So you can see the consistency and the parallel between all of them. Importantly, I think that we recently made a change to include all of that mapping information, and I think it's a real advantage for the students too. It gives us an opportunity at the very beginning of the semester, particularly with our first-year incoming students who haven't seen our process yet, to really talk about how we're generating data and how we're making sure that they're successful in our program. So it gives us a chance to talk about our accreditation standards and that's where our curriculum comes from, and that's really kind of how we're keeping our eye on the horizon and making sure we're always doing what we're supposed to be doing.
Hey, Jim.
Yeah?
This is Carter. I just wanted to remind any attendees in the audience that if they had any questions for you guys, they could just type them into the GoToWebinar control panel over on the right-hand side of the screen. Just a reminder. That's it. Sorry.
No, not a problem at all. Thanks. And we would certainly welcome questions about our process or anything else that certainly comes up as we go through. So again, all of these things are going to appear on our syllabus. When the students get a report back from us after any given assessment that we've given an ExamSoft, those same mapping features will appear on their exam report. So again, we really want students to be thinking about it's on the syllabus, it's on their exam report, where the information is coming from. You know, if you'd asked students before we started this process, how do we derive our curriculum? I think most of them would have just said, well, you all sat in a room and decided that was what you wanted to cover, and that was what you covered. So it was important for them to recognize that there was a method to the madness. The other thing it does, having this information on the syllabus, is again to encourage faculty to think about the big picture and not just about what I individually am doing in any given lecture. Okay, so I'm going to show you an example of is a course level map that has been used in our course sequence, the Systems Pharmacology course sequence. So the reason that we're using these course level maps are because they offer quality control. So as I mentioned, many of our courses have multiple faculty teaching in them. So it offers the opportunity for faculty to see what other faculty in the same course are doing, and it offers the course coordinator an opportunity to have more control over the course and to really understand what's happening. We're certainly mapping to our program learning outcomes, so these are the School of Pharmacy specific outcomes, so it makes sure that our lectures and our course content is in alignment with that. We map to our course learning outcomes. We map it to lecture learning outcomes, and then we also document any changes that have been made throughout the semester. So documenting these changes can happen in a couple of different ways. It can be in real time, as I mentioned. Students weren't understanding. I went back and added more substance to something, reviewed it in another way. But I want to document that because when I'm thinking in the subsequent year, when I'm teaching that same material, I want to be able to refer back to that course map and say, oh yeah, that's right. Students really struggled on this material, and I'm going to try and beef up my lecture, beef up my activities to make sure that I'm preemptively doing a better job of covering that. And so what you'll see on my course level map, again, is just some of the School of Pharmacy things. You'll see Systems Pharmacology, which is my course. You'll see Renal, which is the topic that I teach, and then any other information that's being provided. So this is the course level map. So the first column that you can see is our course outcome. So this is an old map, is the first thing I want to point out. So you can see that this course outcome is actually very detailed. We've gone through some different training sessions to make our course learning outcomes a little bit more succinct and manageable. But that's where the course outcome would be. And again, that's directly on the syllabus for the students to see now. You can see for this particular outcome, just very general, so this could be any faculty who are mapping to this outcome in my course. They'll talk about the lectures and readings that they're assigning, that there's recitations and homeworks associated with this outcome. You can see which of our Appendix B or accreditation standards that outcome maps to, where we assess this particular learning outcome. So for this one, it was on a couple of different exams. And then you can see the results of those assessments. So our percentages, what our averages were, so it gives us an opportunity to think a little bit about that. And then you can see any actions that we're going to take based on the information that was presented in this course level map. So I do want you to see that there's a couple different comments that are present here. The first is from one of the faculty that's in this particular course, who's reflecting on the fact that, particularly in exam 1, that there was a handful of students that failed this exam and she felt that that was problematic. She met with the students one-on-one, so we do have a documentation of some of the things that she tried to do to address the problem with the students. She also recognized that one of the things that the class in general was asking for was more time to have some opportunities in class to go over those concepts. So now in subsequent semesters, she's built in that time as a direct answer to some of the comments from the students. The other thing that you can see was a general course recommendation. So it wasn't just about her content, it wasn't just about that one particular exam, but it was this notion that maybe having a peer tutor for this class would be advantageous. So you can see both of those comments showing on this course level map, which again was shared with me as a course coordinator, and so now I can think about some of those things and where we want to move in the future. Okay, so again, I can document real-time changes, something I did in the classroom that I want to address immediately. But I can also look at suggested changes which are a little bit more long-term, which may not happen that semester, but can happen in subsequent semesters. And ideally, this is really a quality control mechanism, particularly in our team taught courses, but that's not to say if you are the only one teaching in a course that doing a course level map would not be advantageous, because I think that it would be. Documenting these changes and these assessments and all of this information in one place really makes it much easier for you to be thinking about your course in subsequent semesters. So what's the value added for faculty? You know, we hear a lot about accreditors and we hear about administration, but what's the value added for faculty? So the first thing I'll say is it's great information for dossiers. I went up for tenure a couple years ago and I included a course level map and I included an exam level map and I included quite a bit of assessment data in my dossier. And really I think that that set me apart from many other candidates that were going up for tenure, because it's not something that we often take credit for, and it's just taking that extra time to really think about what you're doing in the classroom and how you want to improve. It's great for your annual evaluations that all of us need to do. These course level changes and this reflection is absolutely what administrators want to see. And then importantly, my take-home message for a lot of this is take credit for what you're doing. We're all doing really great things, and we don't take credit for it as assessment, and we really should be. Okay. And then the next thing I'll talk a little bit about is the exam level map. So I often marry these two things together, the course level map and an exam map. An exam map is exactly what it sounds like. This is my opportunity to take all of those things that you saw. What are the different outcomes that I need to map to? What are my different lectures? So I'm taking each of these pieces and really sitting down and reflecting on what do I want my exam to look like. So I can tell you before I implemented this process that I would sit down and write an exam, and I may have my lectures in front of me, and I would just write questions. Oh, this sounds like a good question, and I would just put an exam together. I don't know that that was necessarily, well, I know that that wasn't necessarily the best way to do that, because I may have been inadvertently giving more weight to one topic than another topic just because it was something I was particularly interested in. Having the exam map forces me to stay focused and to really think about what content did I cover in a lecture, what lecture outcomes did I cover, what course outcome does that map to, and therefore what question do I want to ask the student on an exam. It also forces me to think about on an exam where I have 40 points, I don't want all 40 points of that assessment to be knowledge questions. I want to spread those questions across knowledge, application, and synthesis. So an exam map is a snapshot for me to get all of that information, and basically it keeps me honest. The other important thing that I include on my map is the student performance on how they did on each of the things, so I can again address where are areas of weakness, what are things I need to improve on. Okay, so this is just a really small example of what one of my exam level maps might look like. So the first thing you can see is I document what my lecture is. So here is my lecture. It's on hypertension and diuretics. You can see that one of the questions I asked, so what I have here is bank number 2383. That just tells me where it is in ExamSoft. Again, that's a really nice feature because it allows me year to year to say, what were the questions that I went through, what were the questions that worked well, and I can just pull them out again without having to scan through all of my items in the test bank. The other thing that you can see is the pages that are referenced in my own lecture materials. I can always provide that to a student and say, here's where it was, here's where we discussed it. You can see what course outcome it maps to, again, being right on the syllabus. And then you can see my lecture outcome that it maps to. This particular question is a knowledge-based question. You can see that my subsequent question on diuretics, also knowledge, and then I have a question on ototoxicity, and that's an application-based question. So again, I'm tracking and making sure that I'm hitting all of those different targets as I'm writing an exam. Okay, so this is my pre-planning. It just makes sure that I have everything that I need to have and that that exam is a really sound assessment tool. So what we're going to look at, and I'm going to pull this out in another chart, I'm going to look directly at this one particular question, this question on ototoxicity with the loop diuretics. So the content's not important, but what I want you to recognize is how I'm going to piece all of this stuff together. Again, once the students see that exam report, they're going to see the same information. So it's this repetition of the same information coming back over and over again, both for my sake and for the student. So this is a snapshot of what a question might look like in ExamSoft. So it may be a little bit difficult to see, and there's just a couple features that I want to bring to your attention. So the first one is, this is the description. So the description is just an opportunity for me to say what this question was about. So this is a loop diuretics question, adverse effects, and the other thing that I included in this description was learning outcome 5. This description field goes to the students. The students will see this information on their exam reports. So again, they know exactly where this question came from and can go back to their own note packet or go back to the lectures and figure out where I got the question from. Okay, so the students are going to have that. They're going to know where I'm coming from. The other thing that's happening here is I'm thinking about my course and my lecture outcomes also. So I've kept all of this information very concise, and I know that this question addresses those things, and I can provide that information back on my course level map and ultimately to the administration, which gives further documentation that not only am I covering a particular outcome within our curriculum, but at the level that I'm covering it and how the students performed on that outcome. Okay, and the other thing that you can see from this is this is just some information on our mapping. So you can see the really nice feature, and this is also information that the students will get. So as they're thinking across all of their courses and all of the topics they've been taught, one of the things that we're talking to them about is think about where you're having deficits. So the students will see this mapping. They'll see pharmacology, adverse effects, application, cardiovascular, heart failure. So if the students are performing poorly, they can start to address that particular deficit. Okay, well, I have a really hard time with the pharmacology of cardiovascular meds. Great, that's a really specific thing that they can focus on. And another really nice feature for all of us, for people who aren't doing course and exam level maps quite to the extent that we are, ExamSoft has this really nice exam blueprint, which is built right in now. So you can get this overarching snapshot of what your exam looks like, and it really helps to give you an idea of the balance of your exam. And I'm sorry, I'm going to turn it back over to Jane and let her continue on.
Well, thank you very much. As you can see, Dr. Matthews is doing some pretty extensive analysis on what goes on in her classroom. Now imagine if she kept all this information to herself, and you wonder why we're bothering her, knocking on her door, give me that assessment data, because it really is incredibly valuable information. But we do take it a little bit further. She has all this great data, but how do we know? We know she's using it to make good decisions, but how do we know the data is good to begin with? How do we know her test is any good? So all of this presumes she's collecting great information, and her tests are asking good, reliable questions that are well written. Well, I'm going to ask the audience to think for a minute. Where do you keep your exams? Where do your faculty keep your exams? And who gets to see them? Well, prior to taking this technological route that we've gone, a faculty would create an exam, create those test items, and the only people that would ever see the actual items is the faculty member and the students. That's it. No one else takes a look at it. No one else monitors the quality of this, see if there are errors. And, you know, I was just speaking with a faculty member just before this started, and he said, you know, it's funny. In education, we peer review everything. We peer review posters, we peer review articles, we peer review presentations, but we don't peer review something that is the most important to our students, and that's the way that we test them. It's an interesting thing. So we're looking at, well, let's see if we can use this technological solution to peer review our actual exams. So we created this, we call it a PRTI, a peer-reviewed test item process. And here are some of the questions that we developed in the assessment committee. So when I'm looking at a test question, I'm going to ask these things as a peer reviewer. Is the question clear to the reader? Are there any typographical errors or grammatical errors? Is the question coded properly to the right level of Bloom's taxonomy? Is it coded properly to the learning outcome? If this exam question has been used before, what's the data on it? Let's look at the descriptive statistics. How well did it perform in the past? And is the content level appropriate for that course? Maybe a great question for a first-year student, but not so much for a third-year student, or vice versa. So if you think about someone reviewing your test question now and asking all these things, chances are you're going to see there are opportunities to edit and make the test even better. So as part of this peer-reviewed test process, we actually had a professional development day, and we brought in a psychometrician to help train us on how to write better test questions, which I highly recommend. These are just a couple of tips that we picked up along the way from that. Is avoid writing question stems that are too wordy. We were certainly guilty of doing that. Avoid providing irrelevant information in the question stem. Watch for distractor clues. If you're giving multiple choice and A versus and gives you a tip-off of what the answer is, watch for that. We try to avoid using negative language wherever possible, using false, except, and least, and go for the straightforward, direct question. And we remind ourselves continually when we're reviewing questions, with a well-written question, the reader should be able to answer it without ever seeing the choices. A multiple choice question. And what we're constantly looking for as we're peer reviewing a test item, is it clear? Is the student going to spend his or her time on answering the content or trying to figure out what the faculty was asking to begin with? I mean, that sounds kind of basic, but if we looked at ourselves honestly, the faculty are experts in their field. Many have not been trained at all in how to write test questions. So we're asking them to do something outside of their area of expertise and just expecting them to know how to write a good test question. And clearly that's not fair. So we try to provide the professional development to write a good question, but I think this idea of sharing work and peer reviewing is unique, certainly within our college. It's unique that we're doing this within one school. I know you can't read this very clearly, but what I want to show you is this is a screenshot from an exam self-test item. And when I look at the item, I'm going to get the stem of the item to ask the question, but I'm going to have a box here, and one of the sections in that box says internal comments. Now, I should point out there's a box for rationale as well. I could say, here's the question, and I'm going to provide a rationale for what is the right answer, and I'm going to push that rationale out to the students when they get their results back. I have the opportunity to do that. But for the point of this conversation I'm having on peer review, there's also another box for internal comment that the students would never see. When we participate in a peer review process, we go online, and let's say I'm a faculty member and I say, okay, I've written my questions, I've got 3 people lined up to peer review them, 2 content people and 1 person who's a non-content person. And that non-content person is just going to look like structure, grammar, typos, that type of thing. And as they look at the question, they're going to type in their suggestions or their edits in that little internal comments box. And then they'll send a note to the faculty, hey, I reviewed your questions, my comments are in the box, go look at them. And then the faculty decide, you know, I agree with that edit, I'm going to change it, or no, I disagree, I'm going to ignore that comment. The power still is maintained with the faculty. They can reject the comment or they can accept it and make an edit. But what we really like about this process is we have an assessment personnel and administrator. I look at questions, so I'm looking at it. Non-content person, that's fine. But we also have 2 content people look at them. We're all making our questions. And I think I can say with confidence that all of us feel that our questions in our exams are better at the end of this, because sometimes we catch really silly things. I never catch my own typos. So I ask other people to review my work, and we catch typos, we catch grammar problems, and sometimes content problems as well. Particularly if we're teaching something that's a little bit over the heads of the students, we forget that we're asking a question that isn't at the appropriate level. So I really like this process because it shows how we're working together for the improvement of our test bank, of our test items. So Jen is going to, Dr. Matthews is going to share a summary chart of what have we done with this data. So we've done this great peer review process. Are we collecting this information? Are we storing it? What are we doing with this?
Great, thanks, Jane. The other thing that I want to point out from that previous screen is you see that PRTI. So if I go through ExamSoft, I can see all of the PRTI items. So I can see every item that's been peer reviewed. So once it's gone through that process, I can have a lot more confidence in using that particular question. So keeping that in mind, what you see is just a snapshot of 1 course and a couple of exams from the fall semester. And this is just looking at that PRTI process for this class. So there's multiple faculty teaching in this course. So again, we're trying to keep exams consistent and all of our policies consistent. So you can see this was a fall 2013, a systems course. You can see the different exams that were administered. So what was done pre-test? So this is the process Jane was just talking about, that peer-reviewed process. You can see the number of recommendations for each of the exams, 8, 15, 6, and 15. And then you can also see the number that were accepted. Just as Jane indicated, it's the prerogative of the faculty member to decide whether or not they want to accept the recommendations that were put forth in that review process. So not every recommendation was accepted. A good majority of them were, but not every single one. And then we also want to follow up on those same items post-test. So once I had the results back and before I've released them to the students, every single one of us, and faculty everywhere are doing this, we analyze our exams. Okay, so I'm looking at point by serials, I'm looking at distributions. Oh, the students really didn't understand this. Was it that I didn't go over it in class, or was there some other confusion? Whatever the reason is, we're thinking about that and we're addressing it. And there may be questions that we say, clearly the students didn't perform well, and I'll take the ownership for that particular question. So you can see in this next column that there were a few questions before the exams ever went back to the students where items were thrown out or multiple choices, multiple answers were accepted. And then the last column is, now once the students have their results, and I've done an exam review in class, were there additional things that after I've listened to the students explain some of their confusion or some of their perceptions, that I went, you know what, they were right. And so I ended up doing some additional modification to that question. And you can see that that only happened in one instance, but again, we want to document that. And with all of these, if there were things where multiple choices were accepted or a question was thrown out, we would want to make sure that that was modified in some way in our test bank so we weren't using that again in the future. So we thought that this was actually a really successful process and are continuing it this semester. And I'll turn it back over to Jane.
And I think what's important to note in this is that it was done in a very collaborative, non-threatening way. We have administrators and faculty working together. We're both after the same thing, writing good quality test questions, getting the information out to the students, to the faculty who want to use this to make modifications. So the administrators end up with all the data from the faculty, information that only they can provide. The faculty use this information to improve their courses and be the best teachers they can be. And so, in effect, we all win. I mean, I think it's a really good demonstration of using technology to bring us together around a common cause and say, you know, this assessment is a joint ownership process. So it's not convincing faculty to buy into assessment. It's faculty, as Jen really put it, taking credit for the assessment they're already doing. All the faculty do it. All we're asking to do is let us help you bring the data out. Let us help you highlight the data using, in this case, we're using technology. I can't imagine doing this by hand. But we're using this, and both of us get a lot out of the data. The faculty get to claim this on their annual reviews and the dossiers, as she pointed out, and the administrators, if you reflect back on those original course level maps that I showed you and the curriculum level maps, we get to show some comprehensive data that's saying, you know what, we take these student learning outcomes really seriously, and we're working together to ensure that they're covered and the students learn the material. We're really both winning. The example that you saw today is from a professor in the School of Pharmacy, but I'm sure you can understand how this could work in any environment. If you think about tests and even performance assessments and rubrics, how we could look at the rubrics and the performance assessments and peer review the processes for that, what the potential is to marry the work of the administration with the work of the faculty. So I think that quality is a shared responsibility, and I hope we provided a good example of how it can actually work if we're working together. And with that, I think we've left enough time. What we really wanted to do is get to some of the questions that you might have, and maybe some questions about specific examples or anything from the audience that has been typed in as we were doing this presentation.
All right, thank you so much, Dr. Souza and Dr. Matthews. We have a couple of questions. Okay, the first one is, why was the focus narrowed to 3 levels of Bloom's taxonomy in the report that you showed, Jane? I know the answer, but yeah.
You know, that's a really interesting question. Several people had asked about that. We did a calibration exercise. So we looked at all level of Bloom's taxonomy, and we put the same question out to all of our faculty. And you know what? We could calibrate with pretty good accuracy to knowledge, application, and synthesis. But when we tried to break it down to 6 levels, what good is having 6 levels if we can't calibrate it? If you know, someone's putting at the comprehension level, another one's putting at the knowledge level, someone's putting at evaluation, somebody's putting at synthesis. So if we can't come together and calibrate with a fair amount of accuracy, then it's not worth coding to it at all. So we decided on 3 because that's what we at our school could calibrate to. It's as simple as that. Knowledge, application, and synthesis worked for us. If you could calibrate successfully the 6 levels, I say go for it. That's fantastic. We had a hard time doing it, and that's just the honest truth.
Very cool. Okay, another one is, what is the estimated amount of time that faculty have to spend to document all these outcomes? How long does it take after each exam, at the end of the semester, all that?
That's a very good question. I'll let Dr. Matthews answer that.
It is a good question. I'll say that the initial go-through will probably take you more time because you're just adjusting to what the process is. So the first time that I did a course level and exam level math, it may have taken me a couple hours to do each. Now I'm just much more efficient, and that's the way I write my exams. So I write my exams from the exam map, and then as soon as an exam is done, I just export that data really quickly. So that, maybe an additional half an hour after I've gotten the exam results. So I think that the workload is on the front end. Once you've figured out your process, it's really not all that time consuming. And I think that we've seen that with some other faculty here in the School of Pharmacy. And I think everyone has said pretty much the same thing. It's that initial go through where you're figuring out what you want to put there that takes a little bit more time. And then once you know, you fly through it. The great thing on the course level map is all of that information, the course and the Appendix B and our own School of Pharmacy outcomes, they're all on the syllabi now. So that work has already been done, so you can populate your course level map really easily. So each of those different things takes time, and we didn't get to this place in one semester. It was piece by piece, but I think it's really valuable, and even if you started with some of it, I think it will help, and you will really see the benefit to doing it.
Very cool. This next question is a little long, so I'm not going to read it verbatim, but basically the person asking is saying that 90% of his instructors are adjunct faculty members, which can probably pose a little bit more of a problem. It sounds like the staff is made up of doctors who are, I'm going to put this in quotes, old school and resistant to change. They also work off of a modular system and not a semester system, so classes run from a few days up to a week. This sounds like a school with some pretty, it's not the standard, the standard department. Do you have any advice for somebody like this who has adjunct faculty members who are a little bit older and don't work on a standard semester system?
Well, I think certainly in that case it would be very hard to do the extent to what Dr. Matthews has done. However, I have done consulting at different types of medical schools and spoken with an auditorium full of attending physicians and trying to get them excited about assessment. But again, I don't say let's get excited about assessment. I said let me help you figure out a way to get what you want out of the data. So even those old school people, they are all collecting assessment data. So if you can go in there and say, okay, all I want to do is look at the data that you have and figure out the best way to report it. And if you figure out a way to report the data they have, whether it's aligning it with the outcomes, getting a quick snapshot of how the students are doing on those outcomes, you show that same data back to the faculty that, by the way, they generated. You just put it into a form. I think they'll be impressed what they're doing. I mean, and I think that's really the key to it, is not saying I'm going to ask you to do something different. I'm not going to ask you to do something more. I'm going to help you find a way to take the data that you are already generating in your classroom and find a way to report it out. Because once you report it out, it's what everybody wants. So even if you're old school, guess what those old school people are being bombarded with? How are your students doing? What improvements are you making? What evidence-based changes? How do I know that if the students spend X number of dollars on taking your class, that they've changed at the end of it? I mean, that's what everybody wants. That's certainly what the federal government wants to know. So I think, again, if you even take old school people and you say, show me what you're trying to know. Show me what you want you to know if the students have learned. And then I'm going to help you collect that data and put it into a form so that you can make sense of it, the students can make sense of it, and by the way, your department chair can make sense of it. It's not, I wouldn't present it as something new. I would present it as let me help you find a way to report out on what you're already doing. And I'll be honest, I try to be a support for the faculty, and if any of them have trouble developing their own reports, I'm there to help. And Dr. Matthews is, you find these early adopters, as she is. She's like the queen of assessment now in the faculty, and she can help her peers and her colleagues. And so it's not just one assessment professional trying to help the faculty. Now there's a whole cadre of faculty who are really into this data movement, and are assisting each other. Do you think that's fair to say?
I think it is fair to say. I think the only other thing that I would add to that is, we have, it's not an exact parallel scenario, but in our therapeutics courses, we have that same setup where it's often a lot of adjunct faculty teaching in a course. So it's a faculty member who's overseeing it as a course coordinator, but it's adjuncts who are actually teaching. And the course level and exam level maps have helped them immensely, because it forces them as the course coordinator and the person responsible for the course to think about, what are the exams going to look like? What do I want from each person on the exam? And it still helps to make sure that that's a quality assessment, instead of just saying to every one of those adjuncts, okay, I need 5 questions from all of you. Well, if you have a much more clear idea of what you want, I need 5 questions from you, but it's going to be a total of 10 points. I need 2 knowledge. I need 3 application. I need this many synthesis. You're giving constraints to make sure that that exam is quality, even to somebody who maybe doesn't buy into an old school faculty who doesn't buy into some of this, newer technology or things. So I think that those tools are still really advantageous, even with adjunct faculty, and maybe even more with adjunct faculty.
Also, with the peer review process, it's even more so with the adjunct faculty, because our full-time faculty are exposed to regular professional development on pedagogy, on test writing. The adjunct faculty maybe not so much. Some of them are, some of them aren't. So imagine that you have the ability to go in online and look at the questions they're generating and say, ooh, you phrase that and I'm confused reading it. So here's the way I think you can rephrase it to get at your question better. And in that way, you're providing professional development to your adjunct faculty at a granular level, one question at a time. I would really want to look at those adjunct questions even more so than the full-time faculty questions.
Cool. Thank you. Okay, this is an interesting question, just because I think it's coming from a place of just pure innocence. Are the course outcomes different from the course objectives, the way that you're using those words?
The same thing.
No, we use those. We use them the same. She had her lecture objectives and the course outcomes. So we have our program learning outcomes, what we want all of our students to know at the end of the program. And then we have the course outcomes, what we want the students to know at each course. We generally have about 2 course learning outcomes per credit hour, so maybe 2 to 3 at most. But Dr. Matthews has broken it down to her objectives within each lecture. Not every one of our faculty members gets down to that level. So I think she's done a little bit a deeper analysis than a lot of our faculty do.
Perfect. And then for the last question that I've got for you, is each faculty member creating his or her own course map, or is this a small group activity that you do together?
So at the beginning of the semester, as a course coordinator, we send out a course map and ask the faculty to fill out their section of it. But then each section goes back to the course coordinator to fill out a completed course map. So again, it's a little easier if you're the only person in your course, you're just filling it out in real time. For us, in these team talk courses, each person is still responsible for their own part of that, and then it goes to the course coordinator who looks at it as a whole.
And let me give you an example of a faculty member who was teaching his own course. Okay, he had responsibility for the whole course. He had 8 learning outcomes for that course. So what he did, and he did publish some scholarship of teaching and learning on this, he looked at his 8 learning outcomes and he mapped the density of coverage on each one. How many questions did he ask in each area? And then he mapped the performance of the students on each one of those. Now, where the performance was lowest, he, as Dr. Matthews did, he noted on his course level map, I'm going to make this change next year. And where the density of coverage was light, he reinforced it and added more questions. So the next year, he superimposed year 1 over year 2, and he was able to show that the students actually, yes, of course, it was a different student body the next year, but he did show improved outcomes, improved averages on the students' performance on each of the learning outcomes. He has that 3 years now, year over year, and it creates a really nice map for him. It shows now that he has balanced the coverage of each of the learning outcomes, where before he was favoring certain areas. Let's say over the course of the semester he asked 100 questions on learning outcome 1 and 20 questions on learning outcome 2. Well, he would have balanced that. And if the students had a low point in their list of learning outcomes, maybe he added some lectures, maybe he added some other activities to try to bolster that performance level. So he's done some really nice work, and that's an example of what our faculty have been able to do. And he takes a lot of pride in that, documents it, puts it in his dossier. It includes that as annual evaluation. One of the things that I always hear is, how do we assess effective teaching? And you know what a lot of it comes down to is student evaluations. And is that really a good a measure of how effective you are in the classroom? Sometimes, as we all know, that can have a lot to do with popularity. But if you take the student evaluations of your course and then you present that alongside the data of how the students actually performed in each of the learning outcomes in your course, now I think you have a better argument for how you are performing in the classroom. So I like the direct measure of the test and the indirect measure of the student subjective information regarding, or a subjective opinion on how you're doing in a class. I like the marriage of the direct and indirect information to make that determination about how you're doing in the classroom. I do think our faculty are using this data, so it's not just being collected, it's not just an exercise, they're using it. And with that comes a greater understanding, as I started by saying, of why these assessment people and why these administrators are constantly knocking on the door asking for information. They really are sitting on the gold mine, and we really are working together to bring out some information in a very good way. Jen, did you have anything you wanted to add in that?
No.
So if there are no more questions, Carter?
That is all we had. This has been a really great webinar, guys. Thank you so much.
I thank you for everyone taking the time to join us today.
Definitely, definitely. Just for all the attendees out there, I will be emailing everybody a recording of this webinar before the end of the week. So if you would like to share it with any other faculty members that you're with, you most certainly can do so. Again, thank you, Dr. Souza and Dr. Matthews. This has been a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.